should we think that the unreasonable are reasonable simply to spare their feelings? Let's find out coming up next. I've run across a couple of videos by Joshua Rasmussen in the past, and while I may or may not have responded to some of them yet, this video really demonstrates the vast intellectual divide between the religious and the non-religious, or as he puts it in this video, between believers in P and non-believers in P. And the religious really don't understand why atheists don't accept their claims about their beliefs, because the things that they claim are simply not demonstrable, and that leads to them not being reasonable. But being reasonable is what Joshua here seems to think everyone has to be.
There's often two layers to the conversation. There's the conversation about the truth of P, and then there's the deeper conversation about the reasonableness of the believers in P versus the reasonableness of the disbelievers.
But the problem here lies in what your definition of being reasonable happens to be. Because the believers in P, and let's be honest here, he's talking about religion, he has a religious channel, but the believers in Christianity think that being emotional and adopting comforting beliefs and imaginary friends is perfectly reasonable, while the non-believers in Christianity think that it's totally unreasonable to accept anything for emotional reasons without objectively verifiable evidence to back it up. I don't see how you could get from A to B without some kind of agreed upon definition.
I think that if people on both sides of any proposition can recognize the reasonableness of people who disagree with them from their perspective, right? It's maybe not reasonable for them to not believe P from your perspective or to believe P from your perspective, but from their perspective, there's something about their experience on which it is reasonable for them to believe that.
Which really means nothing when you think about it. I don't think it's reasonable to believe that the earth is flat. The majority of people who do take that position do so for religious and emotional reasons because they've adopted a religious viewpoint that says that everything in the Bible is true and passages that can be interpreted as a flat earth must therefore be true, even if they can't be intellectually defended. I'm not going to pretend that this is somehow reasonable when by the very definition of the word, it simply is not.
And I think that if people can really put the light on this deeper layer of the reasonableness, it can facilitate enormous progress over this top layer of the truth of P. We have so much more we can learn from each other.
Except we don't. I mean, sure, I guess I can learn about the cruel nature of delusion and hyper-emotionalism by speaking to those who are delusional and overly emotional. But that's not really something worth learning unless you're planning on being a psychotherapist. Because again, reason doesn't mean what they think it means. The dictionary definition of reasonable is having sound judgment, fair and sensible. It doesn't mean just coming up with some rationalization for believing whatever makes you feel good. So I fail to see what I can learn, at least what would be worthwhile to learn, from people who aren't on the same intellectual and critical plane as I am.
I was actually talking with somebody the other day who was specifically telling me that they will engage people who believe P because their main goal, one of their main goals, is to show them that people who disbelieve P are moral people, good people, reasonable people.
And there he goes again. Reasonable and moral are not the same. Moral is an emotional standpoint. Reasonable is an intellectual one. I don't care if Christians think I'm moral. I care if they can prove that the things they believe, the things they insist on spreading, are factually correct. Because from my standpoint, being reasonable requires that you use logic, critical thinking, and objectively verifiable evidence to support your claim. It's no wonder this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. He's speaking an entirely different language from the world's skeptics.
And it's sort of ironic because in this particular conversation, the believers in P, I'll sometimes hear them say that the non-believers in P are inconsistent and foolish because they don't even believe P. So why are they always talking about P if they don't even believe P? What are they doing with that?
Whether we believe P or, as he's really saying, whether we believe in a God, that doesn't change the fact that believers in gods are real and they do have a demonstrably, collectively negative impact on the planet. That's why we talk about it, to show these people how dangerous their beliefs are, and since one's beliefs inform their actions, so long as they hold this belief strongly, their actions can be negatively impacted and harm us all.
Well, my friend, this person that I met, was telling me why they're talking about P. It's because of this deeper layer. They're defending their own reasonableness because they feel misjudged. And I think rightly so that they feel misjudged. I think, in fact, the judgment that the disbelievers are unreasonable is a judgment based on the perspective of the believers rather than from the perspective of the unbelievers.
But those are two entirely different and, I'd say, irreconcilable perspectives, because the believers do not believe for rational reasons. They believe for emotional reasons. They want the things they believe to be true, therefore they insist that they are, that they somehow have this mystical knowledge that they can't show they actually possess, and anyone who disagrees is a reprobate sinner who deserves to burn for all eternity in some imaginary hell that none of the believers can actually show exists. The problem here isn't whether each side thinks their position is reasonable. The problem is that both sides fundamentally disagrees as to what constitutes a reasonable belief. And until that divide can be solved, it's pointless to even engage. It's like one side is speaking Swahili and the other side is speaking Martian.
Now, of course, we're always stuck on our own perspectives, right? You know, like you're in a perspective, I'm in my perspective. But even though I'm in my perspective, I can have a belief that your beliefs relative to your perspective are reasonable.
Only if we both agree on what reasonable means. And this is where I've had many fruitless conversations with the religious over how rational people operate, and they simply reject it all out of hand because to them, so long as it makes them feel good, so long as they can spin some yarn for themselves that makes it seem possible, then their beliefs must be reasonable to hold.
That is, from my own perspective, I can recognize that you're reasonable from your perspective, even if I think that only one of our perspectives is actually matching with reality.
And in that, perspective ceases to matter, and we can only test our views against demonstrable reality to see which one holds up to critical scrutiny. And I hate to say it, but religion simply doesn't. If you siphon out all of the emotionalism and wishful thinking from religion, you're really not left with anything that can be demonstrably and objectively shown to be factually correct.
So this is how I think we can make so much progress with each other, just by recognizing the two layers in the conversation and realizing that even while we're battling and debating maybe over whether P is true or not, whether you're right or wrong about something, there's this deeper battle over whether you're reasonable or unreasonable.
You are reasonable or unreasonable if and only if you are actually reasonable or unreasonable based on a common definition. And until we have that, we're just talking past each other. I want to believe isn't reasonable. I have faith isn't reasonable. I'm going to be really depressed if I'm wrong, therefore I'm right. That's not reasonable or rational. These words have meanings, and the way the religious tend to use them is not what those words mean.
I think we can get to know each other and recognize each other's reasonableness.
I will not recognize someone as being reasonable unless they can show that they actually are. And the only way they can show that they are is to abide by the definition of the word they are using.
Even while we recognize that one of us has to be wrong.
We could both be wrong. But how do we determine which one is? Because that's really where reasonableness comes into play. The religious demand that they're right because they desperately want to be. They can't actually demonstrate in any objectively verifiable way that they are. It's pure emotion and zero intellect. Their only metric for claiming something is wrong is whether or not it agrees with what they already believe, but conveniently can't prove. That's not how we objectively examine things in the real world, sorry.
I think we're going to be a lot quicker to figure out who is wrong if we first can affirm each other's reasonableness. Otherwise, we're going to just be stuck in our own group thinking that the other is the enemy, and we'll never see that we're wrong.
It isn't like the religious are going to admit they are wrong, no matter how much evidence the non-religious have against their beliefs. Because once again, they don't believe because it's been proven to them objectively through logic, reason, and evidence. They believe because it makes them feel good, and their beliefs are virtually immune to being countered because they can't imagine that they aren't always absolutely right. Debating them is a complete waste of time. Pretty much all the time. See, I don't know how you can ever hope to have a rational discussion with the most fanatical of theists because they live in a reality that bears very little resemblance to our own, at least when it comes to their religious beliefs. Now, most theists are reasonable when it comes to most other things in their lives. They wouldn't cross a street based on faith. They would look both ways. They wouldn't get in an elevator based on faith. They'd look to make sure the elevator is actually real before they stepped inside. But when it comes to their religion, the rational centers of their brain simply shut down. They believe for no good identifiable reason, because it feels good, not because it makes any sense. And that simply isn't reasonable, no matter what Joshua here seems to think. I'm not concerned what makes him feel good. I'm concerned with whether or not the religious can back up their claims intellectually with sound reasoning, following the laws of logic, and being able to produce hard evidence that what they think is actually so is actually so. But they don't care about that. They think that being reasonable means having a reason that they are convinced to believe, no matter how ridiculous that reason might be. But to quote Inigo Montoya, you keep using that word, I don't think it means what you think it means.